For the seasoned chili aficionado, there are days when just the plain old straightforward stew is not quite interesting enough. Enter the toppings. Add some cheese, some crackers, some sour cream. Now we're talking interesting. For some of our students, our curriculum is not quite challenging enough. They long for something to enrich their learning, which brings us to the fourth essential question.
Hi everyone, this is Steve, and the fourth essential question is, how will we enrich and extend learning for students who are proficient? And you'll know, since it's me talking, this is an advocacy presentation, and I will be pushing for RTI to include gifted students. So you can see the district definition here is very clear that we're talking about all students, as it says, maximizing learning for all. Historically, the slide you see now indicates essentially the way things used to work before we included gifted kids. So on your bell curve, the people on the right, gifted, are needing as much intervention and support as the people on the left that are struggling, and yet historically the kids that are achieving below standard are typically given a lot of support, and kids achieving above standard of proficiency less, unless of course teachers on their own can do what they can for them. So what I'm suggesting instead, if you imagine this as a three-dimensional object and folded in half, you'd see that the kids on the right and left are equally different from the mean and therefore need about the same amount of support, although the support is different, of course. So we've reconstructed the diamond, we've turned it into a diamond from a pyramid, indicating that our instructional responsibilities go to the left, to the right, and of course in the center as well. Because all of the kids in our classrooms, whether they're struggling to learn or already very proficient or somewhere in the middle, really need to be at a level where they're being in the achievement zone, which is different for different kids, which is why RTI is supposed to help everyone. So here's the original pyramid as it was incarnated originally with the RTI people. And Tier 1 is supposed to be consistent differentiation, I put in the words high end, for everyone. And Tier 1 is supposedly meeting about 80% of the kids' needs, and that would include gifted kids, except for those who are way out of level. We'll get to those people in a second. So Tier 1 is for classroom differentiation. Tier 2 then, for a gifted kid, would mean any of the things you see pictured there. They might test out of something, they might be offered an independent study, they might be able to finish early and have some anchoring activity, and it would have to do, of course, with the way we group the kids and regroup them. If you get to Tier 3 and you have a kid who you cannot challenge in Tier 1 or 2, you become essentially a referral agent and send them to me or one of the people, the contacts in the building, and we'll see if grade skipping is actually necessary or some sort of subject acceleration. So in this case, you're just looking for kids like that, and if need be, we'll come in and help. So if you take a panoramic view, you've got differentiation to start, which is Tier 1, and it would involve both respectful tasks and flexible grouping, and then of course continual assessment. You'd have to decide on a case-by-case basis whether you're dealing with content, process, or product differentiation. But today, because RTI is primarily concerned with readiness, I'm going to talk about high-end differentiation in terms of readiness for gifted kids. So the question you'd ask yourself while you're differentiating is, why am I differentiating? If you're differentiating for growth, then you'd probably be using readiness differentiation. The other two, interest and learning profile, are equally important, but they're just not the subject of this particular presentation. Okay, so, and this is important, readiness is not ability, it's not aptitude, and it's not intelligence. It's wherever each kid is at the moment they're in front of you in class and you start a lesson. We all want the kids to grow, and so it should be a little harder than what they're accustomed to, but it is not a judgment about their overall capacity. It's just their readiness for this particular moment in time. So there are basically two ways to do this. You can enrich the curriculum by letting kids do something different when they finish, or you can embed the curriculum by making sure the questions that you ask and the activities that they do are at varied levels, so they will challenge different kids respectively. Enrichment works best, not necessarily for the gifted kid, but for the high-achieving kid, because they'll do just about anything you ask. They like school, they're very cooperative, even compliant, and they're very interested in grades and points. So if you offer them something that's interesting to do, even if it's considered extra, they'll undoubtedly do it. So here are some examples of extension menus that would help you differentiate the curriculum. This first one has to do with photosynthesis, and the menu you see is actually in 4 parts. In this particular incarnation, there's an appetizer that everyone shares. Then there's an entree where the kids select one of the 3 you see there. Then there are side dishes where the kids select any 2. And then, again, for the high achiever, if they finish those things, they could either go back and select another entree or another side dish, or if you can have some very captivating dessert, then they can do that as well. In this particular case, it says create a test to assess the teacher's knowledge of photosynthesis, which I think a lot of kids would enjoy doing, especially if they could somehow stump you. Here's another example of an extension activity, which again would probably be most likely to be taken up by a high achiever. The class has read the book, The Giver, and some kids have finished, and so the teacher just says, well, there's a sequel to this called Gathering Blue. If you'd like to read that, please do. There are some questions to prompt you. My own opinion, I would not have them have to write anything. I would try and make this kind of fun, simply a book discussion, maybe with you involved in the discussion, maybe even over lunch at some point, just so it seems as much fun as possible for those kids who are doing the extra. There's alternatives to that then. There are explicit ways to offer extensions. In other words, everyone sees them, like the ones you just saw. As you can see, the Pizza Hut sign says, "We have pizza." And then there's the more implicit. If you look closely, there's a product placement there. They've put Coors Light where it didn't belong before. Apparently, we're not supposed to notice that it's there. So you can be explicit or implicit in the way you deliver this, simply by changing a verb. So what we're trying to avoid for all kids, but especially the high achievers and gifted kids, is mistaking difficulty, where you simply make them do more stuff, with complexity, where they do about the same amount of things, but they're at a more complex or nuanced level. So if you look at the equalizer here, and this is why teachers get tired, you're constantly moving from the left to the right depending on the kid's point of entry. All of us need foundational, concrete, simple things when we're new or don't understand something well, and all of us can move to the right as we get more experience and practice. High achievers and gifted kids tend to start more toward the right. That's why we call it the equalizer. You slide back and forth. So complexity involving more interesting things and more challenging things rather than just more things is exemplified on the right-hand side. You make things more complex by adding abstractions or complexity or multiple facets like that. This is just difficulty. Instead of reading one book, a gifted kid's supposed to read 16. Instead of do 2 problems, they're supposed to do 10. We're trying to avoid that. So if you want to increase or decrease a task complexity, relatively simply, you just do any one of the things you see there. Ask them to work with more advanced resources, for example, or work more independently. Make sure some of the questions are at higher level blooms. These can be planned, or you can do them extemporaneously depending on the situation. So here we've just changed one word from describe to rank. There's slightly more work involved in this, but mostly it's conceptual work because describing something is easier than having to rank them because ranking involves more information. Another example, this is an artifacts box where the kids are examining some historical period, and the task here is to find 10 items to create in the artifacts box that, and this is the key word, represent an historical period, and then they provide informational cards. Then with one change, we ask kids to collect 10, not 20 items, in their artifacts box that symbolize an historical period, because representation is more literal and symbolization is more inferential, so it's more complex. But we're not asking them to collect more items. And that's the difference, symbolize and represent. Another example here, they're working with theorems, math tools, and future developments. An easier question would be to summarize or describe one of those three things. More complex would be a comparison or an analogy, and critiquing them would even be more complex. So you can actually offer this tic-tac-toe board to a diverse class and let them plug in wherever it's appropriate. So we're just utilizing Bloom in this case, and I'm sure you're all aware that they've revised Bloom now. They've changed the nouns to verbs, and creating has jumped to the top. It was formerly synthesis, and now it's creating. And you see evaluation there. I would always add the word justification just to make sure they're not merely evaluating. And here's a tic-tac-toe board. The words you see there, KC, or the abbreviations, stand for knowledge and comprehension application. In other words, they're clues, probably for you, to make sure that this board contains a variety of levels of Bloom. And they're studying myths, and everyone has to go through the center, in this case, to apply it to themselves. It says, what life lessons can you learn from this myth? All class members would do that. The others would go do their tic-tac-toe, depending on where you think they should go, higher level Bloom or lower, or perhaps they just choose it themselves. I don't have time to get into this now, but social media can do all the same things, as you can see that from this chart, depending on whether you want to just remember something or create something. So there's all the social media and the technology that can still be adapted to Blooms. And this is just a little more detail, gives the verbs that would apply in the various circumstances with what they call now Bloom's digital taxonomy, or Bloom's 2.0. For gifted kids, what we would generally recommend is trying to flip the Bloom's taxonomy. So instead of starting with knowledge, they might start with evaluation or synthesis. The gifted kids and high achievers will find the knowledge and other things they need if you give them a high-level question, as opposed to a lot of students who would need the background first. With gifted kids, you can usually reverse that, at least from time to time. I'm teasing Judy Johnson here because the options are mostly healthy. This is from some health website. But if you want the kids to self-differentiate, which is very effective and requires very little from you, just offer a lot of options at different levels and let them gravitate to the one that's most applicable to them. And make sure the gifted kids don't choose and pick something that's too easy for them. I would monitor that, because they tend to do that when they can. They should pick something that's appropriately challenging, even if you end up having to direct them a bit. Another really effective way to do this is to provide more or less structure depending on the level of the kid. So a student who's struggling with lab activities would be given a problem, given a method, and given at least how to describe or present the answer. The further down and to the right, you see the more open-ended or less structured it is. So eventually, for kids that are very good at lab activities, they are the ones that decide the question and the procedure and how to observe and collect data and how to report it. This would be overwhelming for some kids and very enjoyable for others. Again, this is an example of more or less structure. They're exploring New World Explorers here. Group A is given something very specific using a teacher-provided list of resources and a list of product options. So it's the same task, but with different levels of support. So this is very didactic, tells them exactly what to do. Group B is simply told they must find reliable and defensible research. They also do not define paradox, they just use the word paradox. In the previous half, they're told that they should look for explorers that experience success and failure, which is paradoxical. But on Group B, it's more open-ended, and the assumption is if they don't know what paradox means, they'll look it up. They're also told to go beyond the unit's principles and discover some new things. Another example, this is a tiered lesson. All of the students, and this is the case in all cases, they're all doing the same standard. In this particular case, they're looking at heroes and villains in literature. The extended or advanced students are asked to talk about redeeming qualities that a villain might have and a shadowy side that a hero might have. Again, they're essentially paradoxes. And then to convince us that they've made the right choices. The basic, which is typically right from what the class would do or what the textbook would say, asks them to identify characteristics and provide examples of the heroes and the villains in a chart form, and then summarize what makes a character a hero or villain in a short paragraph. And then for kids who need more support, they're charting characteristics of a villain and a hero using a graphic organizer, which is probably provided by you to make the concept be what's tested and not their organizational abilities. In all three cases, they would share with one another, and in all three cases, they'd be working on the same standard. This has to do with art. You'll notice all three groups are doing contour drawing. And what I wanted you to see here is how discrete you can make differentiation if you choose. And even more important, that the way you describe the different tasks is non-stigmatizing. So instead of saying, people that have no art talent do this assignment, people who have some art talent do this, and for people who are future Picassos do this, which would be unfairly limiting, we're just talking about less refined eye-hand coordination, more refined eye-hand coordination, and excellent eye-hand coordination. So it's a very delimited difference. And in all three cases, again, they're doing contour drawing, and in all three cases, they'd probably share when they were finished. This has to do with a proportional reasoning tic-tac-toe, and you can see the directions. They choose one option from each row. And if we studied these, we'd see again that they're all over Bloom's taxonomy levels, just so everyone gets a chance to be challenged. I'm typically asked, do you assign the rows? You let the kids pick. I prefer letting them pick until and unless I find that gifted kids are consistently choosing something that's too easy for them, and sometimes kids that are choosing things that are too difficult, in which case you just address and support. This is another example of tiering by support. Tier 1, these kids need a lot of help framing how a biography is written. So you can see it basically gives you the 5 steps. What is it you're supposed to do? In Tier 2, they need much less prompting, simply told to write a biography using a timeline and remembering to make sure they explain why the person is famous. And the Tier 3 students are given virtually no direction. Just tell about the famous person's life, and now they're asked to do it through a series of letters, which requires them to take the position of the person being studied, which is more difficult to do. Or you can simply ask essential questions that are so broad that kids can self-differentiate. How do humans impact our world is a complex question. It's an open-ended question, as are the 4 that follow. And so you could let the kids respond at their own level of complexity and sophistication. Again, sharing at the end would probably be helpful for everybody. Another example of an essential question. The question is the statement is, when one group suffers, another group prospers. And the questions you see here, do you think that's true? Can you defend your belief? Can you refute that statement or think of an exception? If it's true, why is it true? Or if it's false, why is it false? And then if you feel it's true, how can you change that? Are very open-ended. Kids could pick examples from lunchroom the previous day, or from the Holocaust, or from Manifest Destiny, or anywhere else. So it's very open-ended and allows for self-differentiation. Another way to do this is to ask a series of questions. You can see here they're science questions having to do with global warming. There's an analytical question for kids who think that way, a creative question for kids who like to be open-ended, and a practical question for kids that like to apply what they're learning. And then in this case, they throw in a wisdom question, which could be used as an anchoring activity or in addition to one of the other 3, just to challenge kids. The question is, what responsibility do we have, if any, to future generations to act on global warming now? That's essentially an ethical question, usually a challenge to gifted kids, and might be a useful thing to do just to make sure the challenge level is high enough for those kids. As you all know, I wanted to be as helpful as possible. I've got many, many texts. There's many ways we can approach this if you need some support in making RTI work for gifted kids. And I'll be available all year to do whatever it is you or your school think is necessary. And then I've been given the closing here, and I can't really improve on what was written before by Trish, so I'll just read it. In the end, it's all about preparing the next generation. Thank you all for all you do to prepare our students for their futures, and make sure you talk to the teaching and learning team if you need any help with any of this. Thank you.